Artillery fire pounded the front lines. Heavy casualties were being evacuated to the field medical station. Inside the medical tent, a small girl, hair tied back, hands covered in blood, treating wounds under the screaming sound of incoming shells. "You're just a nurse, get back!" an officer shouted. But when the general appeared, he stood silent for several seconds, then said, "You saved the entire unit." Nobody understood what had just happened. Who was she? Meet Tessa Win, 26 years old, 5'2", from the mountains of Colorado. Small, thin, with a soft voice and direct eyes. She's a civilian contract medic, part of the medical support team at Forward Station 4, Libren Base, right at the combat zone border. Called support, but most of her work was just changing bandages, taking blood pressure, prescribing cold medicine. Nobody thought Tessa did anything important. The medical tent had 6 people, and Tessa was the only one without military rank. They called her Med Tent Girl. Many young soldiers joked behind her back. She should have been a librarian, so gentle and tiny. Only one person at the station paid attention. Corporal Drew, wounded in Afghanistan, who noticed how Tessa handled injuries. Neat, logical, steady hands. In the first week, nobody knew anything about Tessa's past. She ate lunch alone, never appeared at briefings. Some senior military doctors got annoyed when she corrected tourniquet placement or changed medications based on emergency conditions. A lieutenant once scolded her, "You're just a contractor. Don't interfere like you've been to war." Tessa just bowed her head, no reaction. But Corporal Drew noticed. She didn't fight back, but her eyes at that moment, those were eyes that had witnessed life and death. The morning routine was always the same. Tessa would arrive at 0530 hours, quietly setting up supplies while others barely acknowledged her presence. Her movements were precise, methodical, almost military in their efficiency, though no one seemed to notice. "Morning, Med Tent Girl," Sergeant Martinez would call out, his tone carrying the casual dismissal reserved for support staff. "Good morning, Sergeant," Tessa replied quietly, never looking up from organizing medical supplies. In the medical tent, her behavior revealed subtle differences. While others worked with the confidence of their training, Tessa moved with an intuitive understanding that spoke of real experience. She positioned equipment before it was needed, anticipated complications before they manifested. "Think she knows the difference between morphine and aspirin?" Private Johnson laughed to his buddies as they watched her work. "Probably learned everything from YouTube," added Corporal Davis with a snicker. Tessa continued her work, but Drew noticed the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her jaw set just a fraction firmer. She'd heard worse, much worse. During quiet moments, she would clean and organize the trauma bay with an intensity that seemed excessive. Every instrument had its place. Every medication was checked and double-checked. Her colleagues saw obsessiveness. Drew saw someone who understood the details could mean the difference between life and death. One afternoon, while restocking supplies, Tessa overheard 2 medics discussing a complex trauma case from the previous week. "The manual says you stabilize the airway first," said the first medic. "But with that kind of chest trauma, you'd lose them from blood loss before you got the tube in," argued the second. Tessa's hands stilled on the supply boxes. She knew exactly how that case should have been handled, had handled dozens like it under far worse conditions. But she also knew that a contractor's opinion would be worthless, even dangerous to voice. As evening approached and the facility quieted, Tessa remained in the medical tent. She moved through the space with familiar precision, checking equipment that others had already cleared, ensuring everything was ready for whatever the night might bring. Her actions spoke of muscle memory developed under pressure, of someone who had learned that preparation in peace determined survival in chaos. A witness recalled, "I once saw a woman like that in Mosul, no rank insignia, but when the gun started firing, everyone looked to her because she moved like someone who had saved lives, not because of orders, but because she had already lost someone." A surprise enemy attack left Charlie Artillery with heavy casualties. Over 30 wounded soldiers brought back to Station 4. All senior doctors were called to the front lines, leaving only one resident doctor and two combat medics. The medical tent descended into chaos. Tessa almost immediately took command of everyone, stopping bleeding with proper tourniquet placement, prioritizing patients using ABC triage protocol, ordering emergency surgery for a soldier with abdominal trauma, despite having no command authority. At first, the medics didn't listen, but when a soldier survived because of her decision, they started following her lead. Tessa replaced an entire team, controlling bleeding, administering IV fluids, emergency transfusions, one hand holding scissors, the other directing evacuations. A technician stepped back, watching her work, and whispered, "This isn't textbook knowledge. She's done this for real." The influx of casualties had overwhelmed their normal protocols. Bodies lay on stretchers in order of arrival rather than severity. The resident doctor, fresh from medical school, looked paralyzed by the scale of trauma he'd never encountered. "We need to triage," Tessa said quietly, but her voice carried authority that made everyone turn. "Who put you in charge?" snapped the resident, Dr. Martinez, sweat beading on his forehead. Tessa didn't answer. She was already moving, quickly assessing each casualty with practiced efficiency. Red tag, immediate surgery; yellow tag, urgent but stable; green tag, minor injuries. Her hands moved with surgical precision, checking pulses, examining wounds, making life or death decisions in seconds. The kind of speed that only came from experience under fire. "How do you know all this?" asked Medic Johnson, the same one who had mocked her days earlier. "Someone has to," Tessa replied, already moving to the next patient. Drew, curious now, quietly searched through Tessa's records during a brief lull. Nothing unusual. Civilian, temporary medic, background check cleared. But in an old photo from a frontline medical unit in 2020, there appeared someone with a face identical to Tessa, wearing military medical gear, face streaked with blood, holding morphine amid artillery fire. He asked directly, "Tessa, did you ever serve in the red zone?" She only answered, "I was once somewhere with no way out. Only two choices: save them or watch them die." The rumors spread quickly. "She's not just a med tent girl. I saw her perform a tracheotomy with a razor blade. Saved a lieutenant. She uses tourniquets better than the head doctor." A major from the medical corps warned, "If you exceed your authority one more time, I'll recommend your removal from the tactical zone." Tessa just nodded, but she never stopped working. That night, Drew saw her practicing trauma procedures alone in the darkness. Nobody asked her to. Nobody was watching. Only someone who had lost lives over missing 5 seconds would act like that. The next morning brought more casualties. This time, Tessa's actions were more controlled, but no less effective. She worked with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced worse situations and survived. "Where did you learn to do that?" Dr. Martinez asked after watching her save a soldier with a collapsed lung using improvised equipment. "You learn fast when lives depend on it," Tessa replied, already moving to the next patient. Drew began piecing together the inconsistencies. Her civilian contract papers were perfectly legitimate, but her knowledge was too specific, too refined. She knew military medical protocols that weren't taught in civilian schools. She moved through trauma scenarios with muscle memory that spoke of extensive field experience. "The way she handles that equipment," Drew confided to another medic, "it's like she helped design the procedures we follow." During a brief quiet period, Tessa sat alone, staring at her hands. Drew approached carefully. "You've seen this before, haven't you? This level of casualties?" Tessa looked up, her eyes carrying weights that civilian medical training couldn't explain. "Some places, this would be a quiet day." The words hung in the air, confirming what Drew had begun to suspect. This wasn't someone who had read about combat medicine. This was someone who had lived it. As the day ended and the immediate crisis passed, Tessa remained in the medical tent, methodically cleaning and reorganizing everything they had used. Her movements were ritualistic, almost compulsive. "Why do you stay so late?" Drew asked. "Because tomorrow, someone else's life might depend on this equipment working perfectly," she replied without looking up, and I won't let them down again. The word again carried implications that made Drew realize they still knew nothing about who Tessa Win really was. A former frontline doctor recalled, "I once met a young woman in Fallujah, no insignia, no rank, but when bullets flew, she stood in the middle of blood and screamed, 'Follow me if you want to live.' I followed, and I'm still alive today." A multi-point rocket attack erupted at dawn on the 14th day. Part of the camp was destroyed. The entire command post took direct hits, multiple casualties. Communications were severed. Station 4 became the central medical point for the entire region. Tessa assumed Field Medical Command without being asked, establishing red, yellow, green triage zones, restructuring the entire medical tent area, making critical decisions about morphine and adrenaline administration based on precise heart rhythms. A brigadier general was brought in with severe injuries. The on-duty medic panicked. Tessa didn't ask permission. She performed emergency vascular intervention, creating a temporary main artery access using improvised catheter tubing. The attack had been unlike anything Station 4 had experienced. Rockets had struck with surgical precision, targeting key infrastructure. The command center was gone, communications were down, and casualties were streaming in from multiple directions. In the chaos that followed, something remarkable happened. Without any official authorization, without any discussion or debate, everyone in the medical tent began looking to Tessa for guidance. "We need more space," she said calmly, surveying the overwhelming number of wounded. "Move the green tags to the supply tent. Convert the briefing room to a surgical suite." Dr. Martinez, the resident who had challenged her authority just days before, found himself nodding and following her instructions. Something in her voice, her bearing, commanded respect even from those who outranked her. "You," she pointed to Medic Johnson, "start IV lines on everyone in the yellow zone. Drew, I need you managing pain medications. Morphine for red tags only. Everyone else gets what they can handle." Her movements were fluid, purposeful. She wasn't just treating patients. She was orchestrating a complex medical operation with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. The general had arrived unconscious, his uniform torn and bloody. Multiple shrapnel wounds, severe blood loss, and what appeared to be internal bleeding. The kind of case that would challenge an experienced trauma surgeon in a fully equipped hospital. "He's not going to make it," Dr. Martinez said, his voice shaking. "We don't have the equipment for this level of trauma." "Yes, we do," Tessa replied quietly. She was already assembling instruments, creating what she needed from what was available. "Hold this," she instructed, positioning Martinez's hands to maintain pressure on a critical bleeding point. Her hands moved with surgical precision, performing procedures that shouldn't have been possible with field equipment. She created access points, stabilized bleeding, and managed the general's condition with expertise that left everyone watching in stunned silence. After regaining consciousness, the general sat up slowly, asking, "Who treated me?" All the medics bowed their heads, pointing to Tessa. He stared at her for a long time, then said, "I remember those eyes. Fallujah 2020. You're the SPARROW medic, aren't you?" The entire tent fell silent. The general ordered classified records opened and confirmed. Tessa had been a high-level combat medic, operating with the Mobile Emergency Response Unit, SPARROW, in Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. Specially trained for battlefield conditions, participating in casualty evacuations under fire, treating anaphylactic shock in red zones, had saved 37 soldiers under artillery bombardment. After her teammates were killed in an ambush in 2021, she resigned, withdrew from the system, erased her records. The revelation hit the medical tent like a physical force. The med tent girl they had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated was a legend in military medical circles. The SPARROW units were whispered about in military hospitals, elite medics who operated in conditions that would break most people. SPARROW medics, the general explained to the stunned audience, were selected from the top 1% of combat medics. They underwent training that had a 90% failure rate, Those who completed it could function as field surgeons, anesthesiologists, and emergency physicians simultaneously. Drew stepped forward, his voice barely audible. "Why did you come back to work without reclaiming your rank?" She only said, "I once let someone die because I was 10 seconds too slow. I came back, so that would never happen again." The weight of that confession settled over everyone present. They understood now why she had been so meticulous, so intense about seemingly simple tasks. Every action had been informed by the memory of failure, driven by the determination to never let it happen again. "The ambush in 2021, the general continued, his voice heavy with the weight of classified knowledge, wasn't just any operation. SPARROW Team 7 was providing medical support for a high-value target extraction. When the operation went wrong, Tessa stayed behind to treat wounded teammates while the rest of the unit evacuated." He paused, looking directly at Tessa. She was the only survivor. Not because she abandoned her team, but because she refused to leave until everyone who could be saved was saved. The general addressed the entire unit. "Never underestimate someone without insignia. She has saved this entire unit, not just today, but from the very first day." The transformation in how everyone saw Tessa was immediate and complete. The small, quiet woman they had dismissed as an unqualified contractor was revealed to be one of the most elite medical professionals in military history. But more than that, they understood why she had accepted such a diminished role. She wasn't hiding from her past. She was trying to heal from it while still serving others in the only way her conscience would allow. The general's final words to the assembled medics carried the weight of command and deep respect. "Learn from her, not just her techniques, but her dedication. She doesn't save lives for recognition or advancement. She saves them because she understands that each life lost diminishes all of us." Comment, "She wasn't just a med tent girl. If you believe there are heroes who don't need titles, they just need to be trusted at the right moment." After the attack, Station 4 was restructured. The old medical tent was preserved and renamed SPARROW Zone, after Tessa's former call sign. Tessa still refused all commendations. When invited to receive the Medal of Medical Courage, she only said, "I don't save lives for medals. I'm just keeping a promise." But from that day forward, military medical units changed their approach. No longer just teaching techniques. Beginning to incorporate skills, handling psychology during panic, coordinating under pressure, making life or death decisions in 5 seconds. A silent training program was born based on Tessa's actions. Teaching medics how to stay calm when senior officers collapse. Teaching soldiers how to read facial expressions to detect hidden shock. Teaching even commanders to listen to people without insignia. Drew, now a sergeant, opened the first class based on Tessa's method. The motto posted in front of the training tent: "Silence is not weakness. Silence is preparation." The changes weren't just procedural, they were cultural. The medical staff began approaching their work differently, understanding that expertise could come from unexpected sources. The rigid hierarchy that had previously dominated medical decisions gave way to a more collaborative approach. "She taught us something that wasn't in any manual," Dr. Martinez admitted during a staff meeting. "That sometimes the person who talks the least knows the most." New protocols were established based on observations of Tessa's methods. Her approach to triage, her equipment organization, her patient assessment techniques, all became standard training. But more importantly, her philosophy became embedded in how they viewed their mission. The training program that emerged focused not just on medical techniques, but on the mindset required for battlefield medicine. Students learned to work under pressure, to make decisions with incomplete information, to trust their instincts when protocols fell short. "Why do we train in silence for the first hour of each session?" a new medic asked during orientation. Drew pointed to a small photo hanging in the corner of the training tent. It showed Tessa kneeling beside a wounded soldier, sweat and blood mixed on her face. No insignia visible, no name tag. "Because she taught us that the most important thing happens before anyone gives an order. You have to be ready to act when action is needed, not when action is authorized. The SPARROW Zone became more than just a medical facility. It became a symbol of how excellence could emerge from the most unlikely sources. Visitors from other bases would come to see the setup, to understand how a small forward station had developed such effective protocols. But the most significant change was in how medical personnel viewed their civilian contractors. The term med tent girl disappeared from military vocabulary, replaced by proper recognition of the skills and experience that contractor personnel brought to their missions. 3 months after the attack, a ceremony was held, not for awards or recognition, but to formalize the training protocols that had emerged from Tessa's influence. The ceremony was simple, focused on the practical impact of what had been learned. "We've changed how we prepare medics," announced the base commander, "not because we discovered new techniques, but because we learned to recognize expertise wherever it comes from." During the ceremony, one question was asked: how do we identify heroes who don't identify themselves? Drew answered simply, "You don't look for their credentials, you watch their hands and you listen to their silence." Comment SPARROW Zone lives on. If you believe change begins with one person who doesn't need to be known, just needs to be heard. After 8 months of service, Tessa Win left Station 4 in silence. No ceremony, no farewell. But in every medical cabinet, she left a handwritten note. If your hands shake, remember, someone is waiting for them to come home alive. You are not allowed to panic. The first blood-stained medical cloth she had used to save the general was framed and hung in the command area. Below it, the inscription, "She didn't need a title, she needed us to live." 1 year later, the entire frontline medical system changed. Medics were included in tactical assessments. Military medical personnel were required to train in 90-second unsupervised emergency response. Med tent girls were properly called combat field medics. When people searched for Tessa's official records, there was still nothing beyond 2 lines: temporary, civilian contract. Function, medical support. But in battlefield medical circles, when someone asked, "How do I know if I have the courage to do things nobody taught me?" they would say, "If Tessa Win could do it, you can too, as long as you do it for life, not for glory." The final news showed Tessa was working at a veteran care center in Denver, teaching trauma response to military families. No nameplate on her desk, but everyone called her the quiet medic. Her influence extended far beyond Station 4. Medical training programs across the military began incorporating what became known as SPARROW protocols, techniques that emphasized rapid assessment, resource improvisation, and psychological resilience under extreme pressure. Young medics would ask their instructors about the source of these techniques, and inevitably the story of the woman who worked without recognition while saving lives would be told. Not as legend, but as a reminder of what medical service truly meant. In military hospitals around the world, a simple phrase appeared on bulletin boards and in training manuals: "Silence is preparation." It became shorthand for the understanding that the most important medical interventions often happened before anyone realized intervention was needed. The Veteran Care Center in Denver received visitors from military medical units, not for official inspections, but to observe methods that had become legendary in medical circles. They would see an unremarkable woman teaching families how to recognize and respond to trauma symptoms, working with the same quiet intensity that had characterized her military service. "Why do you still do this work?" a visiting colonel asked during one of these informal visits. "Because," Tessa replied, organizing medical supplies with the same meticulous care she had shown at Station 4, "someone taught me that lives are worth more than recognition, and that lesson doesn't stop when you take off the uniform." The quiet medic continued her work, unknown to most, essential to many. Her legacy lived not in records or awards, but in the lives saved by people who had learned to see beyond rank, to value competence over credentials, and to understand that the most important service often happens in silence.
If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to The Veteran Story. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.